Hi, everyone. Welcome all to this new episode of BRICS Briefs. Sorry for delay. Unexpectedly, we faced some technical issues, but now it seems okay. Fingers crossed. Today, we have an awesome discussion with two well-known European professors and old friends of our channel. Professor Glen Diesen, a super popular figure here on YouTube, and Professor Lorenzo Pacini, a young but already prominent Italian academic. There are a few reasons why we chose to invite them, but the main one is that they are both tied to Russia professionally. They have both spent a lot of time there, and they're from Europe. So they are probably the best to discuss the changing situation between Europe and Russia about the Ukrainian scenario. Before we move on, I invite you to like this video to help it reach a wider audience and ask questions in the live chat. Interesting questions related to today's topic will be selected to improve our conversation, but feel free to write down any other ideas you have. We will use them for future discussions. Thank you, and let's start the discussion because we have a lot to talk about.
With global tensions and alliances being redefined. From the ongoing conflict in Ukraine to shifts in European politics, the world stage is undergoing significant change. Following years of limited communication, a meeting between Russian and American delegations took place in Riyadh. On February 18th, the Russian delegation included Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Presidential aide Yuri Ushakov, and Russian Direct Investment Fund CEO Kirill Dmitriev. The U.S. team was comprised of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Special Envoy for the Middle East Steve Witkoff. The delegations engaged in a very serious conversation on all issues including rebuilding diplomatic and trading Russia-U.S. relations, potential negotiations for a settlement in Ukraine, and preparations for a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. In response to this meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency European defense summit in Paris, aiming to forge a unified European response to the evolving situation in Ukraine. However, the exclusion of several EU leaders has raised questions about unity and leadership within the EU. European leaders have insisted their governments must have a say in talks between the US and Russia to end the war in Ukraine, as both Moscow and Washington have indicated there is no role for Europe in the negotiations that could shape the future of the continent. Leaders from Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Poland, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, NATO, and the European Union attended emergency talks in Paris on Europe's security quandary. Adding to the complexities, just yesterday, flash parliamentary elections were held in Germany, marking a critical moment for both domestic stability and the European Union in general. The economy, immigration, and strategic directions within NATO and the EU were the central themes of the debates. The opposition conservatives, led by Friedrich Merz, scored a lackluster victory in the German elections. Alternative for Deutschland doubled its support, recording the strongest showing by a far-right party since World War II. The outcome of these elections may not change Germany's position on major international issues, including first and foremost, the conflict in Ukraine. They may go even worse. Beyond politics, economic shifts are also underway. The trend of de-dollarization is gaining momentum, particularly among BRICS nations. But what about de-euroization? As Europe faces internal challenges, could this signal a broader re-evaluation of global financial systems? To help us navigate these complex issues, we're joined by two esteemed European academics, Professor Glen Diesen and Professor Lorenzo Pacini. Both have extensive experience in Russia and Europe, making them uniquely positioned to discuss the evolving relationship between Europe and Russia, particularly in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. Diesen will share his insights on the implications of the recent German elections on European stability. We'll explore how these results might impact the settlement process in the Ukrainian conflict between the United States and Russia. Professor Pacini will discuss the role of the European Union in the Ukrainian conflict following Macron's unusual meeting in Paris after the USA and Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia. In this compelling discussion, we'll explore the potential for alternative alliances and the future of European economic integration. We'll also examine the economic challenges facing Europe and the possibility of de-euroization. Stay tuned as we dive into these critical issues with Professors Diesen and Pacini.
Welcome, gentlemen. Nice to see you both on Think BRICS. Thank you for your time that you are with us today. Everything's okay with our... Oh, okay. Connection
thank
is
you. Thank you so much for inviting.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Professor Diesen. I would like to start with you, Professor Diesen. The first topic may be a bit too specific, but we can't avoid it, you see, because we're especially interested in how this... No. So, sorry. The first topic I would like to address to Professor Diesen is about Germany. Yesterday, Germany finally had its national elections, which came before the natural term. Surely the crisis was connected to the conflict in Ukraine. What's your first analysis of the results?
No, well, I agree that the election wouldn't have happened, sorry, if it hadn't been for the war in Ukraine. Now, the election results, I don't think necessarily any better than the former government. That is the party of Scholz, the center-left SPD, obviously is down, and we saw a lot of its voters migrating to the more traditional conservative CDU or CSU, and so Scholz will be therefore replaced by Merz. Now, we also saw the rise of AfD, I think 20.8% of the vote, I think. So, coming in second, but only less than 80% from the first place. And of course, third came the SPD, down at 16.4 something percent. So these are huge shifts, massively so. That is, I think this is the biggest drop in SPD's history. Its worst election, and so obviously this was a major shock to the political system. But I guess what will change? I don't think so much. I think they're all part of the more or less the radical center. So I think the main change would have come from AfD. However, they will be squeezed out, I guess, in the cold instead by being excluded from any arrangement. But they will still be in a position to push important political issues on the agenda. And the efforts to deny them a role in German politics, I think, will also harden the AfD and their voters over time. So, again, it's not insignificant. And but saying this, I think the shift to Merz, it's not going to make the Germans less militaristic and less engaged in Ukraine. I think he's probably much more so. He's been more militant than Scholz. He was pushing, not now seemingly, but in the past, for sending Taurus missiles, which would be, again, engaging in direct attacks on Russia. So it's a great question how we got there, because keep in mind that for the Germans, both the EU and NATO were seen as being the main pillars for Germany to again, essentially engaged with the world around it after the Second World War. Now we see both of them having become challenged largely because of the war in Ukraine. So we see that the defeat of the proxy war in Ukraine undermines NATO, and as the US begins to shift, I think the EU will become weaker and then try to make up for it by becoming more militarized. But the overall trend, which you can't really seem to change now, is this economic decline, the industrialization, the failure to digitalize industries, the lack of reliable energy, the growing tensions with the United States, and of course the war itself, I think, has done something to German society. Now you're seeing German tanks again used to invade Russian territory. The German government essentially not wanting to even have diplomacy, only looking for military solutions. So it's a very different. I think Germany is changing a lot at the same time as Europe is changing. So again, I think it's meant to project strength, but all I'm seeing now is decline, to be honest.
Professor Pacini, what's your take on this? We are especially interested in how these results might impact the settlement process in the Ukrainian conflict. Sounds odd, but the Ukrainian conflict is between the US and Russia. But we'll dive deeper into this topic in the next few questions, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Thanks to Professor Glen Diesen for the good words spent. I think that what is happening in Germany actually could be a very important steps next forward to the next conflict. I mean, some people were waiting for this election to reshape the Central Europe geopolitical asset, especially because we know that Germany has always been the strongest economy of the European continent. The results shows us something that, yes, will determine, in my opinion, some of the next steps for the Ukrainian conflict, especially today that we are celebrating 3 years of the beginning of the special military operation. First thing that I want to sublime, something that could be considered curious. If we look to the map of the elections, we see that Germany is again divided in something like the Germany before 1989. But with a kind of inversion of the positions, because AfD got the most the part next to the workers, next to the biggest cities, and the Democrats on the other side. That's something very, very, really interesting in my opinion, because I wouldn't expect, honestly. I was thinking to something more mixed, and this says that there is a huge division inside of people of Germany. And we have elites by one side, and we have worker and people. Yeah, thank you for sharing this, because it's so curious. This could be problematic if they open military a front on the east of Europe. Second, the new president, the new chancellor, he is connected to the BlackRock company. This means that he could be, I say could, an expression of the American elite will. So in the context of a proxy war, it would be so easy for them to let move the biggest economy of Europe to a war asset. And this is coherent with the words of the military chief of Europe, of NATO, and also with the general secretary. They are both talking about moving to a war asset for all the economies of European countries, and of course also for the militaries. And this will determine, in my opinion, the necessity by the eastern countries of Europe, like Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, to balance more the relations with Russia, because they would be geographically the first countries to receive, to get the conflict inside on their territory if they move out from Ukraine. And anyway, Ukraine in this moment would not be at all of its geographical landscape useful for a war, because it's too much destroyed, because it's too next to Russia. And in a strategic point of view, you would never fight there. It would be very useless and too many issues, you know. So it's more probable that they would move to Hungary, to Romania, or of course to these ex-Yugoslavian countries. And Germany moving to a war asset means to take all the European countries, and especially all the Euro-led countries of Europe, next to another disaster. This is a kind of reshape, but in my opinion, it's a kind of reshape going back of decades. It's like during the Cold War, where they will not have any other options except then answering with a positive assertion to the will of the United States and the United Kingdom. But in the same way, you were quoting NATO before. In my opinion, there is still now a battle inside of NATO, because the United States, under the presidency of Trump, are moving in a different way. NATO has always been led by European secretaries, but using American soldiers. These two things are, we need to subline them, because it means that the political direction of NATO has always been led by the United Kingdom. That's because it's the North Atlantic Organization and not the Atlantic Organization. And the United States has been used just to give soldiers meat to be murdered on the battlefield. So in this sense, if they try, as Donald Trump said sometimes, we don't know if it was true, but just he said officially, to go out from the NATO, so this kind of NATO exit, as someone said, the NATO European-centered would remain without the most important percent of soldiers to fight any kind of war. But both United States and UK, they have a huge interest in maintaining the whole Europe under their control. So with Germany under this new asset, it will be easier for both to go on with their will. That's for sure. So it means that if we want to do the war with Ukraine, directly giving a time to prepare the European countries and moving them one by one against Russia in a territory that they will decide, transform it in a battlefield, that would be possible anyway. Maybe with another context, another exit poll of the election, it would be possible to block longer this future.
Okay, so in your opinion, the winner of the German election is a servant of the UK. So
that we have just one thing. We have a kind of we still have the same asset on the political consequences that after World War II, the European asset politically remained pretty the same. So this means that now after this election, we have a Germany that is divided, but it's not the first country of Europe that is divided. And the problem is that European Union as the tool of NATO, and not only of NATO, to maintain the control of European countries is still working. We should respect this hierarchy, removing first European Union as this tool, because without European Union, maybe elections in Germany, but in general, the will of German people would not follow for sure. Because in the elections for the German system, we see that this division, but inside of the people, elites decided for social democracy, but are less people than the workers, the lower classes that voted for AfD. So these results, maybe we should read them by another point of view one day.
Okay, thank you. Glenn, you wanted to add something?
Oh, no, just that I agree on the possible tilt of Germany towards the UK, because it's worth keeping in mind that Merz has been very, well, I guess, transatlantic by nature, but he's also taken now a very more hostile rhetoric towards Trump, seeing that he's undermining NATO and the anti-Russian bloc. So there's now more talk about Germany joining in with forming a more closer partnership with the UK and France in order to become an alternative West, to form a new alternative anti-Russian bloc, to make sure that the Ukraine war doesn't end on favorable terms, or indeed some would want to avoid the war to ending altogether, as they haven't really put forward any alternative settlement and don't even want to engage in diplomacy. I also agree about these divisions, of course, we see in Ukraine. In Germany, and I think this is something that's been building up for a while. Though I think under Merkel, this efforts to look for a middle road to accommodate all the main parties and then exclude the ones at the periphery. I think this was building up problems for some time, and you see it now that Germany is becoming a bit more polarized on some key issues. They responding to some extent with very undemocratic means, which is a bit clamped down on free speech, but also the political discourse has changed a lot, which is if you oppose any of the government's policy, for example, towards Ukraine or Russia, it's just now, well, then you're not standing with Ukraine, you're standing with Putin. This is the main rhetoric. It's either you're good or bad, and you have to fall in line. So this growing intolerance for political dissent, I think, is also a reflection of how there's becoming a bit more divisions within Germany.
Thank you. Let's expand the discussion to the European Union in general. Let's continue with you, Professor Pacini. You recently wrote an article for our Substack blog. It was an analysis of the unusual meeting organized by Macron in Paris after the USA-Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia. We call it unusual because we are not really sure what is it. It's not NATO, but we have NATO chief. It's not the full European Union, but we have the president of European Commission in, and all that under the leadership of someone who is still unclear how he can remain in charge in his country. The European community looks confused, not only about the actions they have taken since the beginning of the Russian special military operation, that you mentioned that today is the third anniversary, but also about their strange, well, I don't like this word, but incestuous relationship with NATO or the G7. People sometimes have trouble understanding where the European Union ends and NATO begins, or vice versa. Over the past year, the European Union has shown its undefined form, internal struggles, threats to Hungary, to other partners, and meddling in elections in Georgia, in Romania, Moldova. So what is going on? What is rotten in the European Union? Will it stay or die soon?
So, what is wrong? This would be a long list. The entire asset, the entire system of European Union has been done wrong, just to don't function, it couldn't realize which was the purpose. And as I said already before, it has been created just to control the European countries. That's because after World War II, it was clear that after all that flow of money coming from the US would be so easy for some of those countries to regain their role in the international context. So they needed to block any kind of autonomies and movement to independence. So that meeting in Paris was something, unusual. But on the other hand, I think it was the clear expression of what is European politics. We had people united together without any representative mandate. I mean, it was a private meeting convocated directly by the European chief, Ursula von der Leyen, selecting people. So it was not an expression of European community. Was not a table done by NATO or by other international organizations. It was nothing. It was like just a meeting with presidents and prime ministers to decide to do something. It was so funny because we should ask ourselves who has convocated behind the scenes that meeting and why. In the same day is that in Syria was beginning of the talks. Now they say the short talks between USA and Russia. And honestly, I was looking to that meeting and was say, wow, that's the total fail of the European politics, because they are answering to order like vassals and nothing else. So because the boss is going now taking another decision, we have to, to decide what to do, because we have invested billions and billions of euros. because we have given really the best of our countries just to be wasted, because, oh, good morning, we don't have sovereignty, and we and so they also suggested, especially Macron suggested, that they will convocate another meeting with other countries that they called minor countries, like Hungary, the Eastern European countries, Spain. This is something very, very, this is a kind of political racism inside of Europe. We are admitting this. European Parliament didn't say anything about that meeting. Nobody said anything, just like it was the most normal thing. And this is the clear photo frame of how works politics in Europe. We could say it's like a kind of deep state under the light of the sun. So they answer to the order and they do what they receive as order and nothing else. We cannot do anything. Did someone in Italy, for example, ask to Prime Minister Meloni why she went there, what they were talking about? No, nothing. And I think also that was the same for the other countries. And it was creepy to see them there, because it was like, the table of the second choice. The true leaders were meeting in another country to discuss how to rule the world. And the vassals were waiting for the Lord to receive the order for maintaining this feudalism inside of the continent, because, oh my God, we cannot think outside of the box. It's totally impossible. This is so clear. And I'm honestly, worried about that, because in many European countries, one of the most important operations gained that UK and US has done, it has been to give a specific shape and don't let the countries to prepare their own political future classes. They are not educating elites. We don't have any more political schools, except then Brussels and Strasbourg, and nothing else. So we will have a very important generational gap, because the generations of the actual presidents and prime ministers, they are already the generation after the first generation. So we had the second generation after World War II. And they still had a school that was based by people educated before the 1946. So we could say that they still knew what was sovereignty and independence. They still had a kind of national pride as their own countries' leaders and as Europeans. But now not. Now we have this gap that would be very problematic, because, okay, we don't like these leaders, so we can move on to next generation of leaders. But what is next generation? Next generation are leaders that have been prepared, knowing that, spending all the money of the contributors for a war of nothing in Ukraine was right, that we must have a total devotion and dedication to European Union, because European Union is the only true future for Europe, that we have to fight against this with an ideological shape. And I'm so worried about that, because if we try to think as outsiders by that, we have this gap, and this gap will not be so easy to be filled, And in this sense, and I conclude, this has been, by my point of view, the disaster of the European Union, but in general, by their point of view, they did a very great job. And today, they need to save European Union, as they are trying to save euro, that is a currency failed, that is artificially maintained in life. But we have, for example, Deutsche Bank. We know that the Central Bank of Europe was created just to save Deutsche Bank, and euro was directly connected to the interests of the German economy. And okay, let's accept this, okay? But now they are maintaining this big lie just on the ignorance of people, and they need to save this European asset, because they will have the chaos as a second opinion, because we don't have many alternatives in all the countries, and political followers to those alternatives. So this means that if that system collapses, we will have the disaster, a chaos. And with a chaos, nobody can govern. You always need to have a kind of, a perimeter where you can contain the dissent, but also the problems, social problems. So they need to save it, and they are trying to do it like a surgeon during a surgery. They are trying to cut off, really, to cut off the people that are not. We saw in the last 2 years, they were attempting to political leaders, just of the few countries that were trying to say something different than the mainstream narrative.
Yeah,
that's how it works. And even if now the American leadership has changed, the interest in maintaining Europe under that control is still the same. If they lose Europe, just pay attention to this detail, they cannot do the war against Russia. We are that battlefield. They don't have the resources and they don't have the people to do that war. And that's so interesting. Because United States and UK both cannot do directly war against Russia. It's mathematically impossible. They need to use someone else. They need to collect other countries with their resources and their soldiers. By themselves would be not possible.
I see. I would like thank you. Because it seems that European Union is forced to remain together. Even the future of the European Union is, we may say, dark. But I would like to remain on the topic of the European Union and ask Professor Diesen and focus on the economic aspects of this European crisis. We often talk about de-dollarization, especially in relation to the BRICS, but no one seems to talk about the advanced process of, let's say, de-euroization. That it's the process of reducing dependence on the euro in global trade, finance, or reserves. This is real, and it is at levels that should worry Brussels. So the question is, again, beyond politics, but from a financial point of view, will Europe stay or collapse? If this form of European Union eventually collapses, might it be more useful for European countries to organize themselves into something BRICS-like association? How do you think?
Well, it's a good question. Can I just give a quick comment on what was just said? I very much agree that this was the second table, by the way, because obviously they weren't invited to Saudi Arabia to participate in negotiations. And I think the main purpose there in Paris was to show that Europe was still a cohesive force to be reckoned with. But instead, it was exactly the opposite. That is, the Germans were a bit uncomfortable with the bit warlike rhetoric of the French and the British in terms of sending troops. They thought this was not the right time. You saw Meloni from Italy coming and coming, I'm not sure deliberately late, but anyways, this was also, she was reluctant to be too critical of Trump. So hedging her bets, not putting all her eggs in this EU basket. So it kind of shows how I think instead of being a display of their relevance, it showed how the EU is becoming more and more irrelevant in the world. And so I thought this was a bit of a disaster as well. And but for the United States, I think they pulled off a nice trick there because again, the Trump administration isn't giving anything away to Russia. Russia has won the war. The Americans are trying to cut their losses, that is to pull out and ideally dump the whole thing on the Europeans. And as the EU see the American pulling away, they want to then double down on their standing with Ukraine rhetoric, irrespective of what the Ukrainians want, by the way. And they double down on this. And now, so the EU is very willingly taking over this this dumpster fire now, which the Americans are running away from, and they're doing it voluntarily just to kind of prove a point. So it's quite extraordinary. And I would just want to also add that while the Europeans were holding their alternative summit in Paris, it would have been relevant if they could have come up with an alternative peace plan, but they don't even want to talk to Russia. All they want to do is continue sending weapons. So it's not clear exactly why they should be relevant. And at the same time, of course, you had Zelensky flying down to the United Arab Emirates, maybe just to be close to Saudi Arabia, where the Americans and Russians were actually meeting. So I'm not sure what the point was. And also, I just want to briefly point out what Professor Pacini was saying about wearing different hats, because this is, when you go past these institutions, this is something we often see. If we remember back in 2003, was it the head of the OSCE then, which was Schäfer, he was advocating for Russians should pull out their peacekeepers away from Moldova, and we will replace them with OSCE ones, except OSCE will outsource it to the EU, and the EU might set up a partnership with NATO. And then a few months later on, he becomes the NATO Secretary General. So they're all walking around with many hats, and we're supposed to treat them like separate institutions. But I think the NATOization of EU has become quite obvious. Sorry for the detour, by the way. In terms of the de-euroization and yeah, that doesn't roll off the tongue easily, and the possible BRICS format. I think that could be something, because what really is the European Union? And I think initially after the European cooperation, initially after the Second World War, I think it had some purpose. It was an institution between former adversaries. That is, you seek security with your opponents instead of against, so with other members instead of against non-members. But I think after the Cold War, the EU shifted. Then they became more of a alliance. That is, instead of seeking security with others, you seek security against non-members. So the Europeans to come more together, and then seeking collective advantage against Russia, but not only against Russia, but also using collective bargaining power. But this is not all bad. This is actually this was a big advantage. This is how geoeconomic blocks actually would measure their success. That is, by having all these smaller to medium-sized countries using collective bargaining power, they could establish a more competitive position vis-a-vis the United States, but also versus the Russians, and they can then have more favorable position. And indeed, when the EU engages its neighborhood, again, like Moldova, they can come with this collective group of EU nations against a smaller one, and they can effectively dictate the terms of trade agreements. They can extract some political concessions. So it's a good tool. And it also functions as a security maximizer. That is, yes, the EU would take some sovereignty from its member states, but it would deliver a collective good as well, as you can't really be sovereign if you stand all alone, was the main idea. So the EU club had something to deliver: economic benefits, political relevance. I think and this is perhaps where the euro also made some sense, but it's worth noting that the euro was never proper, I guess a financially solvent project. That is, usually if you want a monetary union like the euro, you need a fiscal union. And if you want a fiscal union, you do need a political union. So many people conceptualize the euro as a half-built house. That is, once you put in a common currency, it will automatically create some problems. Then you have to force through a fiscal union. And if you push that through, then that's going to have its own challenges. And you have to force through a political union. So for many people, the euro was also not just an economic project, but it was seen also as a way of pushing forward European federalization. So I guess this was the weak economic aspect of the euro. But anyways, it looked like it might have a hope. But I think the main problem of the EU was its larger role in the international system was after the Cold War. It envisioned that the EU and US, they would be these two pillars of the unipolar moment, that is, of collective hegemony, and they would effectively have an incentive to rule together, and all under the guise of common values. But then, of course, we shift to multipolarity. And this is where the EU hasn't really adjusted, because if you want to survive in a multipolar world, you have to diversify your economic ties, that is, connect yourself with all the major powers. If you don't do this, like the EU has been doing, it's linking itself excessively to the United States, cutting itself off from the Chinese, the Russians, and then it ends up being economically less prosperous. It becomes excessively dependent on the United States, and it will see its relevance in the world decline. And this is what we see now. The economies aren't doing well. They're deindustrializing. The US can even destroy the energy infrastructure, and the first instinct of the Europeans is to make excuses for it. Or as the Germans did, the German president who gave a medal to Biden, which is very, very strange, even at the time when they were pushing the Inflation Reduction Act. And now, of course, the Europeans are trying to making all these aggressive statements towards China, which is the last thing you want to do. Well, why would you do this at this point when you should be diversifying? And so the Europeans painted themselves in a corner, which means that the EU has less to offer its member states. Keep in mind that when the Germans go to China, they want to find a way of improving economic relationship. And then their partner with them on their trip becomes the von der Leyens and the rest of the EU gang, which is issuing threats against the Chinese. So they're no longer delivering the interest of EU member states. Even in the political sphere, well, what is the EU doing? It's saying, the head of the EU foreign policy, or the EU foreign policy chief, Kallas, saying that, I don't believe in diplomacy with the Russians. Putin is a war criminal. I don't talk to war criminals. What we should do is break up Russia in many small countries. How can you, if you're outsourcing your foreign policy to an entity which doesn't want to do diplomacy, how is the EU going to serve your interests, the diplomatic interests, the economic interests? And now, of course, it wants to be a big military bloc, which defies not just the Russians, but also America, and wants to sabotage the peace going through. I mean, I think it's a growing disaster. And so what's going to happen? What if you're an outsider looking into the EU at the moment? Would you trust the euro? What future do you see in the European Union? I think they already ran into a lot of trouble before all of this, the war in Ukraine there. So I think this, the trust in the EU, trust in the euro, it's been declining for a while. And then, of course, not just freezing, but stealing the sovereign funds of the Russian central bank. This is thrown shockwaves through the international system. If you want to see why people don't trust the Western financial system anymore, why they're going to gold, why they're looking to trade in national currencies, this is a key reason why. Because if they can do it to the Russians, they can do it to anyone. They can do secondary sanctions. All the rules have been thrown out the window. And so it's what do you do in such a situation? You look for alternatives. And I think that's the direction that we're currently going. And I think that's why there's such a huge demand for BRICS, because it's also because it's decentralized, and it's not actually an alliance in terms of country A and B working for collective advantage over country C. I would consider it more of being anti-hegemonic. This is why also friends and allies of the United States, be it India or even Turkey now, sees a future in BRICS. They don't want their foreign policy and economic policies to be dictated from Washington, but they don't want to be in an alliance against the U.S. to going head to head with the United States is not an interest. They just don't want to live under a unipolar system. So what can the EU do? I think a lot of its problems have come from this insistence on federalizing.
Sorry if interrupting. Let me add one thing related to trust. You know that the negotiations on peace talks have just begun. The negotiating groups have not even been, formed yet. But Russia has already started media throw-ins about the return to the Russian market of American companies that left in 2022. And I would like to point out that these media reports are coming from Russian media, not American or European ones. And even President Putin recently had to comment on this, but he did so with restraint, emphasizing only, in any case, preferences to the domestic companies. My question is, from economic angle, taking into account what had happened before, how do you assess such throw-ins? Do they make Russia too accommodating?
Well, I think they want to draw a division between the ones who are still hostile and the ones who are still friendly, who are becoming friendly. Because I think the main issue that the Russians want to put forth is that countries are willing to have peaceful relations with Russia. They will be treated fairly, while aggressive countries will not. But regarding Putin, though, I think he made it also clear that even though some American and even in the future European companies will be invited back into Russia, it will be some stricter conditions, because sensitive industries, strategic industries, they can't be made that vulnerable again in the future. Keep in mind that, a lot of them just pulled out, which created a lot of disruptions in the Russian economy. They've been able to plug all the holes now. And so for them to make themselves as vulnerable in the future and simply to have Western countries, again, I will use the word steal their money, because it was theft. They did take it. It will be very, it will be unacceptable. But it's, but I think it's also meant to send a clear signal, because the Americans now, they're saying, well, we have to maybe push sanctions away. That's part of any peace agreement, rebuilding trust. They almost make it sound this will be an American concession to the Russians. But at the same time, the Americans are admitting that they've been losing out on hundreds of billions of dollars in trade with the Russians. And this can't simply be brought back overnight. A lot of this has gone to China, India, and other countries in the East, and the Americans will have to fight very hard to get this market shares back. So the longer they wait, the more certainly will be been lost. And given that the United States sees its main future competition being between China and the United States, Russia's not, it's not China. It's this, handing over China and Russia to make it this excessively dependent on China. It's been a huge mistake. So I think they're trying to rectify this. And again, this is how the Americans are adjusting to multipolarity. Don't push all of these Eurasian giants together and then cut yourself out of all their market share. Because this is often when we talk about sanctions, we behave as if it's still the 1990s. If there's only one center of power, you put sanctions, that country now has the option. You can either bow to our will or become insignificant. In a multipolar system, Russia just demonstrated what it means. You put sanctions on Russia. That means you're handing over huge market share to your competitors, which is, for example, China. And the ones who are the belligerent, the one imposing the sanctions, end up losing a lot. And this is what we've seen. The Russians could diversify. Their economy is doing well. They're growing. They're the biggest one in Europe now in terms of purchasing power parity, while the Americans are struggling and the Europeans are especially struggling. So the United States doing the sensible thing. They're reaching out, make some restore economic ties. But I think for the Russians, a key incentive is to tell the Americans to keep the momentum going for ending the war and improving ties with Russia, because they've never seen anything like this before. An American administration actually saying, we did provoke the war. Yes, the sanctions didn't work. We should respect Russia's security concern. I mean, when has this ever happened? So I think, they don't want to make themselves too vulnerable. They also have to do their part in terms of trying to bring the US and Russia together. And to a large extent, this is what they discussed in Saudi Arabia, how to improve bilateral relations, restore diplomacy in order to have the institutions and framework in order to rebuild trust and actually move a peace forward. So I think, it all makes sense so far, but I think the Russians will nonetheless be very cautious.
We hope so. Actually, thank you very much.
Can I just one last thing? Sorry, before I forget. I just want to say that I think this American idea of pulling the Russians away from China, I think this is silly. This is never going to work. America was the main country that tried to destroy Russia. China was the main country that helped it prevail. So, but Russia does want to adjust to a multipolar system, which means it doesn't want to be excessively dependent on any one state or region. So if you can diversify, if you can deal a bit, trade a bit with the Chinese, Indians, Iranians, the Europeans, the Americans, it will do so, but not because it's doing favors to the Americans, but because it's in Russia's interest to have deal with many centers of power. It's good for its economic prosperity, and it's also good for its political autonomy, to the extent, of course, it doesn't make itself vulnerable. So if America's objective is simply allowing Russia to diversify, to not be too dependent on China, sure, the Russians will take it, but they won't turn on China. That was, I guess, my point I was making.
Okay, thank you. Because the idea to take Russia away from China and vice versa, it was also said by Alexander Lukashenko recently. So this is in the air. So we know that. By the way, thank you very much, Professor Pacini. It's your turn. We feel that we should mention that in the Ukrainian scenario, in addition to Russia, Belarus is also involved, which is also facing strong sanctions from the collective West. In a very quiet move a few days ago, the United States and Belarus had a meeting in Minsk, and that resulted in the release of a US prisoner. And in exchange, like New York Times speculates, for an easing of sanctions on the Belarus, particularly on Belarusian banks and potash exports. Our viewers may find this news on our Substack. Well, some see in this a move by the United States to try to detach Belarus from Russia. This concern is legitimate because, as I told, Lukashenko himself said something similar, but about US reconciliation with Russia, arguing that the US might try to turn Russia and China against each other. What is your opinion on both scenarios, briefly?
First of all, as a premise, I don't think that the United States could do or think anything good looking to Belarus. It's curious that in these days we are celebrating the 10th years of Minsk, of the Minsk treaties that should be in the past the solution for Ukrainian Maidan situation. But as we know, both Minsk I and Minsk II has failed, disastrously failed. And that's why we arrived to have the special military operation just exactly 3 years ago. Belarus, in the context of Russia, and Europe, is still now a kind of bridge that, by my perception, it has a very, it is like under an important missing of consideration by European diplomacy and by European leaders. But Belarus still plays, especially for Russia and Russian people, a very important role, because actually Belarus, inside of all the former Soviet countries, is the one that is remained more next to the Soviet asset, nearer to the Soviet spirit. And Lukashenko is still now a leader so loved by the people, so brave, and with a kind of political will that is so strong, determined, and moving on, looking forward the good of the will of its people. It's something that we don't have in many countries nowadays. And he is a person who is trying to negotiate and being like a network for negotiation for many international issues, but always remaining attached to his national interests. He's not a person for compromises. That's it. So that's why, for both scenarios, I think that Belarus could become, I don't know, honestly, Anastasia, I don't know if United States, European countries could really get the trust of Belarus in any case, because the Minsk failed was so meaningful for all Europe and for all the international context. Now the world saw that to don't respect the Minsk treaties were the European countries first, and were, of course, the United States of America. So I think that Lukashenko and its people would like to see first a switch in the American behavior. The American diplomacy has always been based in the last century on arrogance, on wars, and the deterrence doctrine has always been the same. Just because we can make a war, we can destroy you. So that's the first step of our talk. Russia knows this very well. And in my opinion, they will ask the help or use Belarus again as a kind of neutral platform to talk with other countries of Europe, and maybe to try in a future scenario to deal a peace or to deal a discount of the consequences of what is happening. Because if European Union, European countries in general, but European Union will follow the decisions of the United States, or will decide by themselves to go against Russia and in general to go against the multipolar war, I totally agree with the words of Professor Diesen. Russia will try, and all the multipolar countries will try to deal a solution. That's something that similarly has done Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin when talking about de-dollarization. He said to the United States, but we are still ready to use dollars for international trade. That this doesn't mean we don't want de-dollarization or we are not working for that. This is pointing the finger on who has the decision in the hands, because de-dollarization has been a consequence of the decision of the United States, a consequence of their economy, a consequence of their intelligence, has been that, nothing else. So you pose the sanctions, the whole world goes out from the sanction. So it's so easy. And you have to understand as a very concrete soft power that you are not the world ruler. So this would be pretty the same for all Europe. Belarus has a very important, just to consider this, ethnical mix for all. Russian ethnies, but also some European ethnies. And his location and his military power cannot be not considered by European leaders. So will arrive maybe one day soon where Lukashenko will enter as a player in this role, in this game, and we say, okay, just remember that I'm here and I have the authority to decide something. This would be very interesting also for China. Yes, Lukashenko said that this is one of the ideas of the Americans. I honestly agree with that, by the way, because the new government of the United States is full of people expert in Iran and China, just because they declared since the rally for the elections that they want to make troubles for China and Iran. And even if it is the demagogy of the elections, it's clear that they will try to do something like that. They are trying with the corridors in the north. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're trying being aggressive for all the American continent with Canada and Greenland, etc. And they will trying to do that with Taiwan, of course. And I think that both and they conclude, Russia and China, Belarus could be a very good network for maintaining together so compact that alliance that is based. Many people said that it's based only on economical interest, but I don't think so.
That's because not true.
the last 4 years, China and Russia has established cultural cooperation stronger than in the past. And inside of a very, very, very similar direction of leadership inside of BRICS, I see that it is continuing something deeper, and maybe behind what we see officially, they are working stronger for that. Also, and I really conclude, the military exercise of last week with China and India together, and also Belarus, that has been a clear sign of cooperation just to close the wall of Asia, and literally to close the wall of Asia in its continental and its rimland part. And Mongolia also was participating. And this means that they are enforcing to give also this vision outside of the Eurasian context, that they are united, and if they want to attack the heartland, they need to front many other important countries. Really, that this would be, in my opinion, Belarus would be next months, next years, maybe central in this diplomacy.
I see. Thank you. Thank you for your deep analysis about Belarus. Actually, for those of our viewers who haven't seen yet our video, we dedicated especially for Belarus, because now it's a BRICS partner country. So the last dictator of Europe, like Condoleezza Rice, once called Alexander Lukashenko. So if someone is interested in, please watch our video, and you will be interested, and you will understand why the United States is so interested in Belarus today. And we are almost 1 hour online. Just a brief question for both of you. Professor Diesen, what do you think about Trump's recent threats to impose tariffs on BRICS nations if they try to replace US dollar? Could this actually push back or speed up the formation of alternative alliances, actually? And maybe some Western European countries like Serbia and Hungary will go closer to the BRICS?
Well, I remember back in the 1990s in the academic literature, there was a lot more open discourse and honesty in terms of some of the challenges which might befall on the unipolar moment. And one of them was that the unipolarity had to be a temporary phenomenon, because over time, of course, managing an empire, the empire would exhaust its resources, as we've seen now, but unavoidably new centers of power would begin to emerge at the periphery. And then it would be predictable that the hegemon would then use its administrative control over the economic system more coercively to prevent the rise of rivals, because if you allow rivals to emerge, then the system won't be unipolar anymore. And again, this is what we've seen. And then, of course, the main problem is what happens when the hegemon uses all this economic coercion. Well, then the entire trust in this liberal economic system, which the hegemon argues that it's managing, it collapses, and that's what you've seen. The growing economic coercion from the United States, it will feed less trust and will only create more demand for diversifying. That is, for the Russians, of course, the financial issue is key. That any reliance on American banks or currencies, this has resulted in them being cut off. But it's not just the Russia; it's also the Chinese. They saw that any dependence they have on American technologies, supply chains, anything can be weaponized against them. So any economic dependence on the U.S. is seen as a weakness. So my point is, what happens when the United States says, well, either use our dollars or we'll destroy you? It's only signaling very clearly that if you use the dollar, this is the weapon the American will use to destroy you. So yes, you might have some countries that may have to bow, which is probably the smaller, medium-sized ones. But then it's predictable that the larger states, be it China, Russia, they will then push through it and start to create alternatives, because once they accept or bow to this pressure, then they're owned by America, because now they can be forced to anything. They're sending a very dangerous signal to the United States. If they can be bullied into only using the dollar, why can't they be bullied into only using American technologies? So I think the larger countries, they will seek to it will only incentivize them to move a bit away, while the smaller, medium-sized will wait for alternative platforms, so they can help to diversify. I think it's also very contradictory, because it doesn't help the United States. It should be doing the exact opposite. That is, the first rule of economics is you need predictability, you need trust, and this is why that's why there's a lot of distrust in terms of when America's now, as Professor Pacini just pointed out, when they're reaching out to, for example, Lukashenko or Russia, because I spoke to Lukashenko actually in October. I met him in Minsk at the Eurasian conference, and they really want to be this bridge between East and West to promote the trust. And they don't want to be a part of an anti-American bloc. They want to be able to accommodate the multipolar world. But if the Americans are seen to take advantage of this opening in order to break its adversaries, of course they're not going to trust them. And I guess the same now applies with Russia. Keep in mind that the Chinese, America, and the Europeans, they used to reach out to China to ask them to help to break Russia. They said to solve the war. Of course, they didn't want to talk to Russia. What they meant was we want to, put pressure on Russia so we can break Russia. Meantime, the same American politicians are telling their audience at home, well, once we've broken Russia, we can focus our resources on China. So they ask China to help them break Russia so they can then go after China. So the Russians obviously now are a bit concerned that if the Americans want the Russian help to break China, then obviously the Americans going to come for the Russians thereafter. So there's a lot of lack of trust here, which is why I think you will have the definition of trust by Ronald Reagan, which was trust but verify. I think they will want to work with Russia, to America. They want to diversify. They want multipolarity, in which America obviously is a pole in order to have stable multipolarity. But I don't think anyone really trusts that America's completely given up its dreams of global primacy, though.
Thank you. I would like to ask also you, Professor Pacini, just one word answer. If the European Union one day falls apart because of its internal disagreements, which European country, in your opinion, will be the most likely to join BRICS?
That's so complicated. By the actual European situation, I think Hungary would be the first. We saw the request by Austria, but in my opinion, it was the tentative of a kind of inside job. And that's why they absolutely didn't consider that application. For sure, we'll never try both UK and France. Because even if we don't see so clearly, but because there are historical problems between the relation between France and UK, the European political leadership is under France and UK since Westphalia. Professor Diesen has written a lot about that. And that's why I think that only the countries staying on the Eastern Europe will try to do that, because they will also be, by a very concrete, pragmatical point of view, the first countries able to join to that economical corridor. Central Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe countries would need more time, because they would have to skip the countries that are in the middle. So that's why I think Hungary, because we saw that Hungary was working a lot for that. And secondly, I really think that will be some Northern Europe countries. Because instead of what we see, the situation, Professor Diesen knows, of course, better than me. I come from Southern Europe, but it would be faster for their economies to join in that kind of system. For Italy, for example, would be very important for BRICS, because it's the natural prosthesis of European continent inside of the Mediterranean Sea, and this would be so important. I've written a lot about the Mediterranean Sea in a multipolar context, but I think that we still don't have the awareness of how to do that. We would need one generation more to prepare, to educate the people, to understand the meaning. Just for example, consider that no one talks about BRICS. No one knows anything, also in the academic world, the scholars, about what is multipolarity. No one. So we are missing the main news of the day. Totally missing.
Okay, thank you. So you bet on Hungary, not Serbia.
So Serbia, in my opinion, Serbia would try to do that, but the political situation of Serbia is just
complicated.
Very, very, very quickly, Anastasia. Sorry. Hungary has a very stable situation for its internal politics, borders, etc. Serbia not. Serbia is divided. Serbia has been divided. Serbia has a Balkanic important historical issues still to solve with all the other countries that they have been divided. Serbia has next Turkey. This means that the pressures would come also by another part of Europe, okay, and Serbia, it's by my point of view more infiltrated than Hungary. Hungary is easier, would be really the first one for very pragmatical points, because they have the asset to do that, they have the interest, they have enough stability, so they are a good possible partner, a good potential to join.
Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, I think it's time that we close, because we are over 1 hour with our discussion. It was very interesting. It is interesting, and I hope we will see each other on our channel one more time. Actually, thank you for both of you. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, I hope our audience enjoyed it too. Well, unfortunately, we have no time to pick up the question from the comments, and we see a lot of them. I don't know. We read them all. Don't afraid that you are just writing and we miss them. No, but we definitely will use your comments, your questions for our future episodes. That's for sure. But meantime, show your appreciation with a like and subscription, and keep commenting so we can invite our guests again and again to interact with your questions. Thanks for watching, and thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.